This episode of Over a Barrel is brought to you by Valero believes in being good neighbors. That's why they don't just fuel our cars, they fuel communities too, with thousands of volunteer hours and millions of donations. Right now, coming up on Over a Barrel, the staying power of OPEC, why they matter. Over a Barrel starts right now. Welcome to the program. I'm your co-host, Matt McClain. Patrick DeHaan joining you on the screen. For those of you listening on Spotify and all the other audio aspects out there, we obviously have a video component to us as well. And we would love for you to actually join us on the video because we show graphics and animation sometimes too. How you doing, Patrick?
We throw a lot of stuff up there, don't we?
We do. We have all
I'm
kinds
just sitting
of fun.
throwing graphics up in the background. I kind of feel like I need to find one right meow.
There you go.
Yeah.
Well, how are you doing? How is everything going in Chicagoland?
It's cold, Matt. It's getting really cold. I'm not driving as much. The motorcycles are put away. I'm back from my trip a couple weeks ago, which was great. And back in the office and watching oil prices do their dance and, the Middle East, watching the balance of the Middle East. And, to your point about the today's topic, OPEC and the staying power. So many times, you hear about U.S. oil production being at record levels and people hear about OPEC this or that. And, I've heard a lot on social media. There's been memes about President Biden breaking OPEC. We'll get into that on this episode, but there's a lot of interesting dynamics that OPEC is still relevant. They still have some staying power. It may not be what it once was, but OPEC still matters.
All right, well, let's go ahead and dive right on in. OPEC has made some announcements a few weeks ago, something about the idea of, output and whether or not they are going to increase, decrease. Talk to us about that a little bit. What have they announced? And let's talk about that.
Yeah, Matt, at least for now, Saudi Arabia and OPEC Plus, essentially Russia and some other countries as well, back over a little bit over a month ago, decided to delay increasing oil output. That was when, by the way, oil prices were plummeting below $70 a barrel. And OPEC, unsurprisingly, said, well, we're not going to raise oil production just yet with oil prices low. So come December, though, this is going to be something that they're going to be talking about. And with the price of oil kind of struggling again as of lately, $60, $70 barrel range, OPEC is probably getting a little bit tired of having to wait to restore oil production. Saudi Arabia's got like 3 million barrels a day of spare capacity. Russia probably certainly wants to produce more oil. There's been some cheating, Matt. By cheating, we mean OPEC has official quotas on how much oil to produce. And when countries produce more than their quota, that's when they're cheating. So
do we put them in timeout, or what are we doing?
Yeah,
here?
put them in lockup for a little bit in terms of they can't increase production. But there's been quite a bit of cheating. Iran has been cheating. Now they don't necessarily have an official quota because they've been sanctioned, but countries like Iraq have also been overproducing. So, it's interesting, Matt, for all you hear about the U.S. being the world's largest producer, which we still are, we still pale in comparison to the amount of oil production that OPEC has. We're talking about, as of late, they still produce about 30 million barrels a day of crude oil, and that is a lot more than the U.S. We're just north of 13 million barrels a day, and that's why OPEC can matter. Interestingly enough, I mentioned earlier about President Biden, right? Obviously, there's been kind of a fraught relationship between the Saudis and the Americans. President Biden infamously going over to Saudi Arabia and fist bumping MBS. After the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, who is a journalist. And so there's been a lot said about that fraught relationship, and I'm not really sure where pundits are suggesting that President Biden somehow broke OPEC. I think actually when he released oil from the SPR, that's the argument, that a one-time release of crude oil could somehow break OPEC. It's not that easy.
Or maybe the gasoline reserve in the Northeast. Maybe that was it.
One of those two.
I couldn't help it.
But to suggest President Biden has broken OPEC is vastly, vastly overstated. You may hear some people politically aligned to one side of the spectrum saying that, but trust me. Now, I will say President Biden didn't break OPEC, but OPEC, these countries, Saudi Arabia and Russia's reliance on oil as a form of revenue, they themselves broke themselves, if you will. That is, the Saudis started spending lots of money on really, and we've talked about this on this program, right? The what was it, the mile-long building or whatnot that you mentioned probably over a year ago.
Yeah,
That Saudis, well,
yeah,
think about it, but as the
Neil.
Saudis have spent more and more money, their bills have gone up and up and up. And so, if anything, the Saudis have kind of put themselves in this corner that they really, they need the revenue, but they're also so hard pressed for a higher barrel price that they're kind of stuck in this corner of what to do: produce more at a lower price or produce less at a higher price. They really need the revenue. So producing less hasn't pushed oil prices up, which is what they've tried to do. So the biggest question is, will they throw the towel in on that strategy and just start to raise production?
Yeah, the Neom project. I was trying to figure out exactly what it was. I do remember talking about that, and they've actually
Building,
they've
yeah,
started.
yeah, and building buildings in the desert's one thing, but yeah, I'd be more interested to see if they can produce water out of sand. That may be a better effort.
Anything's possible, sir.
And speaking of water out of sand, there have been some storm systems. If anyone's been watching the desert in Africa lately, the Sahara flooded. What was it, a couple of weeks ago or more
Yep.
recently? So those are some tremendous pictures. But
They
um,
got a year's worth of rain in just a matter of a couple of like a month or something.
yeah,
I don't.
there's actually standing water out in the desert. It's rather incredible. It's like kind of harkens back to what, a Disney movie, Aladdin, right? We're in the middle of the desert and you'd never find a drip of water, and suddenly there's pools of water. So
Should be interesting. All right. Well, let me ask you this about OPEC's decision. They've decided to kind of do what? They're holding back a production
yeah,
increase. Do you think that that has anything to do with the American presidential election that's
haha,
coming up in November? Do you think,
there it
in
is.
other words, do you think that they are A, I'm going to give you some multiple choices here. A, trying not to intervene and get involved in the election either way. They're not trying to help either person win the election. B, they're trying to manipulate the American presidential election by not dropping oil prices, by increasing output. Or a little bit of C, both of the above. I mean, what are your thoughts? Or D, none of the above? What's going on?
I don't think I can give you a good answer. I mean, certainly, I think you'd have a valid argument that, are they doing something? Potentially. Will we ever know? Probably not. We know oil prices are very influential, which is why we're doing this episode, because
Right.
OPEC is still influential. Could they move the needle? I suppose, but so far, Matt, it's just not been their time right now. The global economy is really been stagnant, especially in China. China has really struggled the last couple of months with economic growth. More recently, they've tried stimulus, which hasn't really worked, and Chinese demand, which has been a big part of IEA, the International Energy Association, and OPEC's forecasts for oil demand next year. A lot of the growth was from China. But if China's economy is not growing, neither will oil demand. So that's where they've been struggling a bit, is that global oil demand is going to happen at a slower pace. So that's going to be a problem for OPEC next year. Are they trying to influence an election? I don't even know that they would be able to muster the power to do that right now because of the balance of a weakened economy. They're not in really a position of strength at the moment. They could be if Chinese economy, if the American economy were both really strong right now, they might have a position of strength. But there's so much ample spare capacity, Matt. Russia has spare capacity. Saudi Arabia has spare capacity. Um, that it's tough to have the muscle when there's so much oil and so little demand. And maybe that's not the most fair assessment. I can just imagine people right now are saying that's not, there's plenty of demand. But I want to put it out there right now that it's just a weak global economy is overpowering OPEC strength.
Yeah. So the question mark that I would have is, do you think that they could have the willpower to let's say they want one candidate to win over the other. Okay, would they have the willpower to reduce production? In other words, stomach the loss of revenue for 30 days to try to create turmoil in the U.S. election, or vice versa. Release a glut of oil, because you just mentioned they have excess capacity, to
Yeah.
also try to manipulate the election by sending crude oil prices down really low. And do they even have the well, understandably, if all of them just suddenly just turned off the spigot, so to speak, and OPEC said no more oil, of course that would create a problem. God forbid. But do they? I mean, what are your thoughts on all of that? I mean, we're very close to the election, and Lord knows we usually get an October surprise of some sort. So, what are the thought processes behind that?
I mean, it probably would not go over with the U.S. real well if there was election interference from, if it was a boisterous election interference, if they were touting their election interference. Right now, it's hard to know with all the noise that's going on if countries that make up OPEC would have a stance and what stance they may have, because you may not, there may be pros and cons on both sides of the political spectrum, that, there's additional risk with one party or another party. It's tough. And while oil is a big part of the revenue for these oil producers, as tempting as it may be to try and sway the election, they may be rolling the dice. So what if they try to push the election one way and it goes the other? They don't want to risk the ire
Yeah.
of the candidate who eventually is elected, who they were, potentially rooting against. So, it's one of those things. You might think that they want to get into the fold, but one of those things where maybe they want to stay a little bit on the sidelines and act a little bit quietly.
I mean, you have such an interesting dynamic when you really stop and think about it, because you have Iran and Israel not playing friendly with one another. You have the United States saying we will always have Israel's back. In fact,
Yeah.
they, a few weeks ago deployed U.S. military into Israeli soil with the THAAD missile system. You've got so many dynamics going on there, and obviously Iran is a major oil producer, and you have the OPEC. I mean, there's a lot of geopolitical dynamics there, a lot, and it's a very
Yeah.
delicate. I mean, it's a balancing act. It's that balancing scale that you always see, back and forth. How much weight is on one side versus the other, and is it
Yep.
balanced? There's a lot there. There's an awful lot of layer. There's a ginormous amount of layers on both sides of that scale right now, and everybody seems to be kind of, poking and prodding at it to see exactly what's going to happen.
I think there's a lot said there. Whether or not it's true or not, and how much influence that remains to be seen. But taking a jump over here, Herman is a great follow on Twitter. Just kind of highlighting here what's going on with OPEC countries, who's exceeding quotas. And I mentioned earlier, Iraq was one of those that was. I mean, we're talking about almost 300,000 barrels a day that they're producing above their quotas. Look at that. Even Russia is above their quota. Saudi Arabia is above their quota. And this is what we talk about when there's cheating. So all these countries have prescribed quotas, right? How much oil they're going to produce. That's how OPEC works, is it talks to its members and says, you get to produce this much. And some of these members produce a little bit more because they want more revenue. So it's certainly interesting. And Nigeria has been
They're basically
underproducing.
undercutting their own alliance. Sorry to interrupt you, but they're
Yeah,
basically
yeah.
undercutting their own
They're kind of
alliance.
shooting themselves. Well, some of these countries are shooting themselves in the foot. Some of them are not. But look, Matt, if you look at the bottom here, the axis, look at the countries. Well, I think for the most part, Iraq is really the major outlier here. Look at the scale. So the negative, nobody's underproducing by more than 100,000 barrels a day. Well, I guess you could say on the flip side, nobody's really overproducing by over 100,000 barrels a day except Iraq, but United Arab Emirates and Kazakhstan are both getting close. So, but in the months ahead, as quotas go up, keep in mind, not everyone gets the same amount of quota increase if there are quota changes. So that kind of may incentivize some countries to cheat. And if I'll probably try and look up a a spare capacity graph here. It's really
Mhm.
interesting because you'll see where the spare capacity exists. And those are the countries that are more likely to have incentive to cheat because they've got a lot of extra quota, or excuse me, a lot of extra spare capacity.
There's a lot there, understandably, within OPEC. What does OPEC stand for? I don't think in all the years I've interviewed you, I do not remember ever asking you that. I looked it up once, but now I've asked you, and you're like, oh.
No, no. I
It's
mean,
like
it's
an
one of those things.
organization for something.
Yeah, as an analyst, that's one of the first acronyms you know. It's the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries.
That's it.
And not everyone's a member. Like the U.S. is not a member. I believe Canada is officially an observing member, so they don't participate. That would be problematic because of capitalism and because of monopoly laws. If Canada were openly discussing, but that doesn't stop some producers, as folks of this podcast have known, that some U.S. oil executives have spoken to OPEC to try and influence them. But at the end of the day, Matt, it's kind of funny because these countries, OPEC producers, Russia, Saudi Arabia, are not beholden to the United States, right?
Right.
When President Biden goes over there and tries to get them to increase production, it may be a fool's errand. These countries are more beholden to their citizens and their agenda, which, as oil producers, as members of what many call this cartel, or what this organization does, is it tries to maintain a very tight balance of oil prices low enough where people still consume oil and don't turn away from it. At the same time, the highest price that they can obtain without trying to reduce their market share or reduce oil demand down the road. So it's a really interesting balance. But as part of the U.S., and by the way, the U.S. is producing a heck of a lot more oil than we did, even a decade ago. The U.S. And most of that back then was like Alaska oil production, which has really fallen off. We used to only produce 5 to 6 million barrels a day during Obama's, I want to say, kind of right between his first and second term. And
Mhm.
we've more than doubled that. So we've come a long way. And technologies like fracking that Kamala Harris had been staunchly against prior to her being the VP of the Biden administration. Now she's come out and the pendulum has swung the other way, right? And Kamala Harris is very much about fracking. So even that's an interesting dynamic how that shifted.
Don't touch that device. We've got more Over a Barrel coming up right after our sponsor, Valero.
All across America, you'll find Valero at your go-to gas station, volunteering with local charities and fueling communities 365 days a year, so you can always get where you need to be, right now.
And now for the rest of Over a Barrel. Are there a lot of other places in America that fracking would turn loose additional petroleum reserves that maybe no one has tapped yet?
Well, sure, some areas, but some areas that may not make as much sense. So fracking has been hugely successful in like the Bakken, right? Areas, and it's not just crude oil. Um, there have been other benefits as well. And speaking of, by the way, OPEC, one interesting dynamic as well is Guyana, next to Venezuela. And maybe some folks have been listening. Venezuela has seen kind of a massive decline in oil production because of the corruption there. But Guyana, the neighbor to Venezuela, has some of the largest proven oil reserves as well. And for those that haven't been paying attention, Guyana has been this country that has seen massive increases in investment. The U.S. To show this graphic here for those of us who are watching us on YouTube. If you don't, you can join us on YouTube and participate and see some of these graphics. But Guyana has been really, I mean, look at this, Matt. 2019, they were producing virtually nothing.
Wow.
And right now, as of this article, which was written in January of this year, they are projected to see, almost 1 million barrels a day in just 5 years or so of time. So Guyana has been kind of this wild card that has been producing. And you look at crude oil production increases in Guyana versus some of the largest oil producers. The U.S. has seen the biggest jump in oil production from 2020. Now, keep in mind, some of this was because of COVID, but look at Guyana making a huge surge. Even China in terms of biggest increases. Canada is on there as well, even though the Trudeau administration in Canada has tried its best to limit oil production. We've still seen a huge increase. So, globally, Matt, we produce and consume about 100 million barrels of oil every single day, which is huge. And Guyana now is much more a contributor, and that's really changing much of Guyana's total economy. And here you'll see in this photo, Guyana and Venezuela being neighbors. There were some fights that were happening in these offshore waters. Venezuela was trying to claim these offshore waters as theirs.
I remember that.
Yeah, so that's been an interesting factor as well. But overall, Guyana is exporting more and more crude oil, which has been really remarkable, seeing how the investment has gone. Companies like ExxonMobil have really been investing heavily in Guyana, and that's been a big behind a big increase in some of this additional production that's not from OPEC.
Yeah, and then here in America, are there other locations? I know that fracking has basically, Oklahoma, for example, has benefited greatly from that. And there have been other states that have, North Dakota, for goodness sakes,
Yeah.
has benefited greatly from fracking. Um, the key is, would there be other areas? I guess I'm just trying to figure out long term. Where are oil companies going to go next in their idealism to get more petroleum products where it logistically makes sense? And I have seen, and actually a few years back, I actually interviewed an oil industry person. I can't remember his name to save my life right now, or even what company he was with, but nevertheless, indicating, hey, all the cheap oil, the easy to obtain oil,
Yeah.
a lot of it is already gone.
It is.
And so it's basically technology had to advance forward to get at the capacity of oil that is a little bit more difficult to get a hold of, or decades ago was not technologically possible to get.
Yeah, exactly right. And I show a graphic here that's a few years old, but certainly really interesting as well. Um, you can see where the shifts are happening. You mentioned Oklahoma. Look at New Mexico. North Dakota had a gold rush back
Sure
in
did.
2016, 17. A lot of that has kind of slowed really down. But look at Texas on this chart. West Texas, the Permian, Eagle Ford have all been significant sources of new oil production. And just to kind of give a overview of what U.S. oil production looks like as well. This is where U.S. oil production comes from. Much of it, again, in Texas, West Texas, Gulf of Mexico. And this is why hurricanes, the primary impact from hurricanes, Matt, we've talked about has been gas prices, but there are hundreds of rigs out in the Gulf of Mexico that shut down. And so you see a hurricane, it can make an impact to the refineries in Texas and Louisiana, but it also can make a big impact to U.S. oil production. California has been, declining. Alaska has been declining. California, obviously, they don't want to really invest in fossil fuels anymore. But if you look at this and look at the Appalachians as well, that's where a lot of gas, natural gas, has been derived from in recent years. But yeah, you look at the mid heart of the country and North Dakota, again, the Bakken, Eagle Ford, Permian Basin, and West Texas. A lot of those are slowly maturing, meaning that, yeah, to your point about, where are they going next? That's a big question.
I know that there's been a lot of conversation, believe it or not, in Illinois as a potential option for fracking the southern half of the state. And even into portions of Kentucky and Indiana. In fact, oil companies have already, bought the quote-unquote underground rights or drilling rights to hundreds of thousands of acres across the southern half of Illinois.
And those are
Which
the areas
surprises me,
also that had been really strong for coal as well. So you get down into southern Illinois, Kentucky, into your space there, Tennessee as well. Some of those where West Virginia coal mines, there's a lot down there, whether it's coal or gas or oil. And to your point, I think oil companies have really slowed down looking at new places to drill and exploration. It's been very expensive, and they've just been kind of letting it ride. But You
So
know,
how do they counter OPEC? And that's the reason why I'm kind of asking those questions. I mean, it's all basically a game back and forth from one side of the Atlantic to the other. How do you counter OPEC with that aspect to make sure that there is a national security interest in all of these aspects? Because if the U.S. produced no oil and had to rely 100% on basically countries that don't like us so much, if we're going to be really honest about it, then that creates a problem. So how
yeah.
do you create that balancing act back and forth, understandably,
Well, I mean, don't know that you can,
right?
there may not be a whole lot of control that you can have there. I mean, OPEC, you can, and this is why, relationships do matter. Relationships with oil producing countries. And right now, the relationship with Saudi Arabia, right, is that we sell them arms potentially. And that's why we've stayed on good terms. We've also defended them. So, it's a balancing act on if you can scratch their back, they'll scratch yours kind of thing. But yeah, that's where
Right.
relationships play a key role in this. In both nations moving forward, the Saudis with more modern defenses, and the U.S. with potentially more oil. So yeah, it's definitely a back and forth. I was going to pull this up here, Matt, and I'll make it bigger. In terms of the sources of U.S. oil, as I mentioned, the Permian in West Texas has been a big part of it. Eagle Ford as well, Bakken and North Dakota. And everyone else is kind of, well, look at the Gulf of Mexico. That's a good portion. But look at the growth, Matt, since 2018. It's
Mm-hmm.
really all been West Texas. So, and now that is likely starting to mature, it's going to be on to the next place to see where it is.
They may
And it,
look at some place like in Illinois or some other place where right now they only own and that's just one example. I'm sure they have other options across the country as well as the thought process.
Well, and what's the political environment in Illinois? It may be a little bit more challenging as well, a little less friendly. It's kind of like the Canada stance, as Canada just wants to ban or make it really difficult to drill for oil. Whereas you look at Norway, Matt, and they're saying, "Hey, we'll continue pumping oil, and we'll use the money for investments to move
Mm-hmm.
towards EVs." That's probably the smarter way. Realizing that there's a global need for something, why wouldn't you sell it into the global market? Canada has the opposite take. Canada's take is, well, it's irresponsible to sell, what is under our soil for the better good of the global economy, instead of saying, yes, we'll sell it and we'll use that money to move away from fossil fuels like Norway's done. So it's been really interesting watching those kind of two different countries have different stances. All in all, though, with the U.S. producing a lot more oil, Matt, we are less reliant on OPEC.
Yeah.
The problem with U.S. production, I was going to pull this up here,
Mm-hmm.
um, is that our crude oil in the U.S., the challenge we have is a lot of and we've spoken about this in the past, refineries in the U.S. were built in the 60s, 70s, generally, a lot of them were, or earlier, they've modernized. Back in those days, Matt, when refineries were built, we were importing a lot of heavy oil, especially from Canada. Canada has long been our source. And so our refineries were built based on the environment at the time, which was to produce refine a lot of this heavy oil. And in recent years, as the US has increased our production, a lot of our oil, if you look, here's the scale, heavier and lighter oil, there's been a kind of a steady production. And this is the weight of the oil essentially. Heavier oil has a lower API and its gravity. So heavier oil has a lower gravity. Lighter oil has a higher gravity. Heavier oil produces more heavy products. And the other thing too, Matt, is depending on the way your refinery is set up, you have certain ways your refinery was set up, certain units that were geared more to producing or refining heavier oil. And you can't just substitute heavier oil for light oil. Refineries have to be reconfigured. There have to be new units because it's much different distilling heavy oil than it is light oil. And light oil is going to produce more light product like gasoline. And more heavy oil is going to produce more heavy product like asphalt and diesel. And so, even stuff like that matters. And that's part of the reason why we import a lot of crude oil from Canada, because we produce a lot of light crude oil that our refineries aren't necessarily set up to process. because they were built at a time that we were importing a lot of heavy oil.
Is there a difference in the quality? In other words, if our refineries were structured to handle that, is it a lesser quality gasoline?
I wouldn't
Is
say
it
it's
lesser?
it's maybe less quality, Matt. It's just that there may be more work for heavy oil. Heavy oil may have more sulfur content in it. Not to say that light oil doesn't have as much sulfur content, but it's not. Yeah, I mean, I guess this API gravity is talking about quality, right? Quality lighter crude oil, it generally takes less work to refine, but it also does not yield as much heavy product. You're talking about heavy oil generally requires more work to refine, more desulfurization, and some of these like tar sands, they're pretty, from Canada. It's pretty intensive energy wise to get those oils into a form that can be consumed. So that's the other thing to consider here is that heavy oil generally yields more heavy products, but you could almost say it's a little bit lower quality.
Yeah. Well, that's good to know. I've gotten a heck of an education today, and I'm sure those of you watching have as well, because that's a lot of information that I don't think most people realize, and I like breaking that stuff down sometimes because it explains so much. Knowledge is power, right? So the more you know, to pardon the phrase of a network back in the day, and I won't sing the jingle, but you know what I'm saying. I mean, the more you know, the more you know, and
Yeah.
it helps. It helps tremendously because it then allows you to.
Well, when there's all these
filter.
political conversations happening, you can say, okay,
Exactly.
this is what's true, this is what's
It
not.
allows you to filter appropriately the comments that are being made in public back and forth a lot better.
Exactly.
No matter whose voice or political spectrum or whatever it may be, it's just here we are, and here are the facts, and here's what everything's structured to do.
Yeah. So, and to wrap this up in a bow, Matt, it's going to be really interesting here in the months ahead. Will OPEC increase production? Are they going to throw in the towel and say enough's enough? We want to recapture market share. They're going to flood the market with more oil. Those are very real possibilities. So, we'll be especially watching for, how the election could change the relationship that we have with oil producers. But for now, OPEC still does have power. Biden did not break OPEC. They still have some power, but they don't have as much power as they did, 10 years ago when the U.S. was producing just a fraction of the amount of oil that we are today. So OPEC is still relevant. Maybe not always to the same degree, but they still certainly control a significant amount of the world's daily oil production.
Well, good to know. Patrick DeHaan, as always, it's been a hot minute since we've done an actual breakdown like this on a topic, and very much appreciate the knowledge that you have shared with all of us, sir. And as always, thank you. All right, that's going to wrap up this edition of Over a Barrel. Make sure you join us again next week. We sure do appreciate it. And, of course, like, subscribe, do all of that. And if you have any questions you would like for us to answer, Patrick has the rundown on all of that. The podcast at gasbuddy.com.
That's right.
I'm Over a Barrel Matt on X, formerly known as Twitter. And then he's at GasBuddy Guy because he has been forever and a day. And, yes.
Throw some comments,
Absolutely.
Let's get some feedback.
We'd love to hear from you. And we do get questions, and a lot of times we'll even private message the folks back and say, hey, here's your answer. So we're equal opportunity. We always make sure we respond regardless. So thanks so much for joining us, and we'll be here again coming up next week.
See you later.
This episode of Over a Barrel has been brought to you by Night or Day, Rain or Shine. Valero keeps the pumps full 24/7, 365 with a reliable fuel supply. Because keeping pumps fueled keeps business pumping and communities moving right now.